Greetings, friends, and welcome to Wake Up in the Word for a beautiful Tuesday, beautiful fall day here in the Carolinas. Grab a good cup of coffee and join me over in the book of Romans. We're starting chapter 13 today. But let me also remind you, if you're in our region, we have two big meetings coming up this week. The fall meeting of the Carolina Baptist Association tonight out at Horseshoe First Baptist, and then on Thursday, we'll be at Beulah Baptist for the fall meeting of the Polk Baptist Association. A lot going on for us this week, so I hope to see some of you at one of those meetings. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about different kind of set of meetings, the meetings of those people who have the rule over us, regardless of what nation we live in. And that's vastly different from country to country these days, isn't it? Well, Paul talks about this, and I want you to keep in mind as we read these words that he's writing this during the reign of an emperor named Nero. Talk about one of the worst of the worst. Yet he was the emperor in Rome, one who would martyr a number of Christians. And as we look at this fact, it's perhaps astonishing to some people that Paul would write the words we are about to read. Let's see what he says, beginning in verse 1 of Romans chapter 13. Let everyone submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. So then, the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Well, do what is good, and you will have its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. For it is God's servant, an avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. Therefore, you must submit, not only because of wrath, but also because of your conscience. Now, we'll get into some of the other, shall we say, principles involved here, but even with an evil government in charge, Paul is saying, basically, you submit to that government. Now, did Paul himself always do that? Oh, no. There are some other principles that are involved here. In particular, they were laid down in the book of Acts as we see how this was practiced by the early church. Yes, the people who were spreading the good news of the gospel, the early missionaries, like Paul himself, were always sensitive to the local governing authorities and tried to obey the local laws, right up to the point that the local governing authority contradicted God's law. Now, when that happens, what do? I say there's a very simple authority principle involved. When authorities conflict, what do? Do you disobey God to satisfy a secular authority? No, you always obey the higher authority, even if it upsets the lower. And in many cases, we will see Christians who've been persecuted through the centuries because of that principle. Christians make the best citizens of all because they have this principle laid down that you are to submit to the government that is there for your good, to order society and to obey its rules and regulations. You always stop at that stop sign, don't you? You always pay your taxes, don't you? Yeah, you always obey those rules and regulations of the local authorities, even if you don't like the latest rule they handed down, as long as it doesn't conflict with God's authority. But when there's that clash of authority, God's versus human authority, and human authority gets it wrong, maybe asking you to sin, then you always obey the higher authority. Might get you in trouble, might get you thrown in jail. But as they said in the book of Acts, who are we to obey, God or man? Well, in those cases, you always obey the higher authority. But what Paul's giving us here is a general idea of what do you do with that government of the civil authority, the government that's in charge over you wherever you live. Well, it's easy to say, hey, obey the laws of that government as long as they don't conflict with the laws of God. And that's what Paul is trying to lay out here. These rulers are there for a reason. And as long as they do their job, do it well, it gives us an ordered society into which we can share the good news of the gospel. And I think that's Paul's chief concern. Well, in particular, as we listen to some of these principles, Evans puts some good light on them. He says, look, since God has placed governmental rulers over us, we should submit to the governing authorities, recognizing them as God's agents. While there is an institutional separation between church and state, there must never be a separation between God and government. The closer God is to a government and its citizens, the more ordered the society will be. The further God is from a government and its citizens, the more chaotic the society will become. Now, it's interesting, he wrote those words a long time ago, but yet we've watched this play out as there are people in our own society who have said, we don't want God to have anything to do with this government, and we don't want to obey the government, and we don't like Christians either. And it's causing a chaos that we see in many parts of our country today that's unmatched by anything in our previous history. So whenever you have rebellion against God, it causes chaos in governmental systems. And right now we have an awful lot of that going on. And in the places where God's rule and reign is celebrated and order is restored, there is a big difference. You know, I watched a couple of the interviews with people in Memphis, Tennessee this week, as they talked about how the National Guard coming into their city has not only allowed many criminals to be arrested, put in jail, and gotten off the streets, but one lady in particular was saying, for the past 5 days, I haven't heard a gunshot in my neighborhood. Now, wait a minute. Was she saying that she often hears gunshots? Yes. She said, for the past 5 days, my kids have been able to play in the street and enjoy playing with one another. Were they not enjoying that before? No, they weren't, because criminals had taken over certain parts of Memphis and you just couldn't make it. Well, when the government says it's time to bring order back, and if the local authorities cooperate with that, so you have various levels of government working together, what do you get? You get order. One guy being interviewed said, this is the first time I've been able to sleep all night without hearing gunshots in so many years I can't remember. And as you listen to that, you get a picture of what government is supposed to be there for, to bring order into society. And when we have that kind of order, what does it do for the gospel? It allows us to share it more freely and more openly. What happens when you don't have it? Well, look at a couple of those cities that instead have said, no, we not only are in chaos, we're going to deny that we're in chaos. And then we're going to say, no, we don't want anybody to come in here and help us with that from the higher power in government. Instead of submitting, then they are rebelling. And there's even more crime and more terror happening in those cities. So we see this clash happening all the time. For the Christian, it takes wisdom to try to see how to deal with each and every one of those situations depending on where you live. Sometimes government oversteps its bounds. Sometimes it goes into places it should not. Under the Joe Biden administration, for example, two of our favorite Christian universities, both Baptist in their founding, Liberty University and Grand Canyon University, were attacked by our own federal government. Matter of fact, the largest fine ever given against a school was levied against Grand Canyon, a Southern Baptist-based school. And these attacks came in an unprecedented way, while other schools that seemed to be violating the law in other directions were not only ignored, but their law breaking was encouraged, because they were just on the other side of things. It's been a terrible time in America as we've watched this discrimination against Christian schools, which now suddenly has changed in the last couple of years. And now those good schools, I call them good schools because they're Christian-based, have found relief from the attack, the persecution of the government. And other schools have found that, hey, they can't get away with doing things that are illegal or should be illegal. and they'll have to give an account. This is the back and forth between whether governments are righteous or unrighteous at any given time. And as Christians, it's important that we try to stay below the radar of a lot of those attacks so that we can continue to do job one. What is job one for the believer? Sharing of the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ until he comes. Now, where does this go with government? We'll get into it a little bit more. We've used up all our time already this morning, but stick with us as we talk about the implications of Romans 13 on our everyday life. Join me again right here tomorrow when we wake up in God's Word.